Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me? So the worry about giving a talk not long after lunch is that you all fall asleep halfway through it. So thank you to Q2B for arranging the convenient fire alarm for some fresh air. So it's nice to meet you all. This is my first time at Q2B. My name is Duncan Jones, and I'm the head of cybersecurity at Cambridge Quantum. Now, hopefully, this room keeps pace with the quantum news, and so you will be more than aware that Cambridge Quantum last week announced its completion of the merger with Honeywell Quantum Solutions. So we are now all part of Continuum. What you may have also seen, depending on how up-to-date you are with the news, is that we announced something else today, which was the launch of our first product. So in this talk, I'm going to explain a little bit about the motivations behind that. But first, I'll just say that I joined Cambridge Quantum about a year ago. And so I don't come from a quantum physics background. I come from a sort of humdrum, normal cybersecurity background. And the reason I decided to move across the fence, the quantum fence, was because it became clear to me that quantum is uniquely capable of doing things in the space of cybersecurity that you simply cannot do classically. And so that was what drew me across, because I could really see that the landscape of cybersecurity was going to be fundamentally changed in the future by quantum technology, and I wanted to be part of that. But before we dive into what the future looks like, let me take you back in time for a minute, if this works. There we go. So let's go back to 1984. And so this gentleman here is holding a Motorola Dynatac 8000. So this is the first commercial mobile phone that was ever, or cell phone, sorry, I'm forgetting I'm in California, cell phone that was ever produced. And in fact, the guy in the photo conducted the first ever cell phone conversation. I think this was a reenactment several years later. But just imagine for a moment that this is your product that you're taking to market, the first ever cell phone. Now, that's not going to be the easiest sell, is it? I mean, these things, they weigh 2 pounds. There's a reason this thing was known as the brick. Back in 1984, this cost $4,000. I mean, that's something around $10,000 in today's money. And considering the fact that in my house at home in the UK, I don't always get good reception, I can assume cell coverage back in 1984 was problematic at best. So who was buying this in '84 when this first came out? Now, whenever you bring some new technology to market, you get your early adopters, the fringe, the lunatics, the people who buy anything that's new and great. But aside from those people, the market would have taken a long time to develop here because there were some significant challenges to overcome. We all carry iPhones in our pockets now, but somewhere between here and there, we had to overcome all these problems. I mean, this thing had 30 minutes talk time and 10-hour charge time. Now, the reason I've taken us back to 1984 is because I'm sat here in 2021, and it kind of feels a bit similar for quantum cybersecurity. So we know out there the companies that we all want to work with, they want better cybersecurity. Cyber attacks are rampant. Just this year, we've seen the Colonial Pipeline hack, for example. That took down chunks of US national critical infrastructure for a few days. And similarly, that came sort of fresh on the heels of SolarWinds, which swept through organizations and the federal government. So, there are people out there who want better security. And those people are turning to encryption, right? Encryption is one of the key defenses that we can use to keep data safe. So we know there are many, many, many keys out there being generated every day. Just think about the cloud platforms, data centers, hardware platforms, thousands and thousands and millions of billions of keys being generated. But the question I would ask then is, well, how many of those are being generated with quantum technology? A tiny fraction, a minuscule amount, right? And this is weird because quantum should give us what we need here in this space. Quantum's got, as you guys know, some amazing properties. And at its heart, it is fundamentally unpredictable. And that's exactly the core ingredient you need for cryptography. When you encrypt something, your data is only as secure as the key you use to encrypt it with. And when we describe a key as being secure, what we mean is that it's unpredictable to your attackers. So we have quantum, which gives us unpredictability. We have a problem in the market, and something's not gelling at the moment. So if you ask governments, for example, why this is the sort of opinion you'll get. Okay, so this is a quote from a white paper that the UK government released last year. So they say, in practice, the unpredictability that QRNGs can potentially offer is hard to realize. So what they're saying here is that they agree quantum has the core ingredients to be really, really interesting, and yet, to date, there hasn't been a way to tap into that properly. They haven't actually seen anybody do something that realizes the potential that should exist in quantum technology. So why is this? I've spent a long time thinking about this, and I think it boils down to the assumptions that have been made in the past. So look at the diagram on the screen. This is an example, a very simple example of a random number generator. So you've got a laser firing photons at a mirror. So this is a mirror set at 45 degrees. It's partially silvered, so half the photons will pass through and hit the 1 detector, and half the photons will bounce off and hit the 0 detector. So the question here is, does this device create good randomness? Well, intuitively, you would say yes, right? There's a 50% chance of it going in either direction. You don't quite know which way it's going to go. So, this is looking good. The problem comes when you pick up a design from paper that makes a lot of sense, and you bring it to the nasty real world where you have to build the thing. And then you start hitting problems. So you start discovering that your laser doesn't work the same way when it's at 30 degrees Fahrenheit versus 100 degrees Fahrenheit, or when it's 3 months old versus 5 years old. You'll discover that when you ask real people to build real mirrors, they're not perfect. They have small errors. And so you don't get exactly 50% of your photons going in one direction and 50% in the other. Perhaps worst of all, detectors. They're a nightmare. Trying to find a pair of detectors with similar efficiency to one another is very, very difficult. And so you're going to end up with more photons being picked up on detector 0 than detector 1. And the net result is you're not actually getting the randomness that you thought you were going to get. Now, you might think, okay, well, a solution to this is we'll do the best we can. And because we know it's not quite right, we'll run it through a bunch of kind of processing steps to clean it up a bit, to try and make sure there's just as many zeros as there are ones. And then just to make sure everything's okay, we'll test it. And then if it passes the test, we're done. Unfortunately, randomness doesn't work that way. So von Neumann said this in a paper back in 1951. There is no such thing as a random number. There are only methods to produce random numbers, which is a slight head scratcher. But what he's saying is, you can't give somebody a chunk of zeros and ones and say, is this random? You just can't do that. You have to look at how the randomness was produced to understand whether it's actually random or not. So if you're going to test or verify anything, you have to test and verify the process that you went through to make the randomness, not the randomness itself. Now, of course, there's a Dilbert cartoon for everything. So here's my Dilbert cartoon. So here Dilbert's taking a tour of the accounting department, and he discovers the new random number generator, which does admittedly look quite suspicious. But the problem is, you just can't be sure if something's wrong or not, right? Because anything's possible with randomness. So what we need is a completely different paradigm, right? So we are stuck today, or until today, in the device-dependent paradigm. So this is where we build ourselves some kind of complex thing in a box, some Heath Robinson construction of lasers and mirrors and smoke. And then we reason very carefully about what this device might look like, and we characterize things, and we make a bunch of assumptions. And then we run it through a bunch of software algorithms to try and improve things, and then we test it, and then we say, here's our randomness. We need to move to a different approach entirely. We need to move towards a device-independent approach. So this is an approach where you, instead of trying to say anything at all about what's happening inside this device, in the ideal setting, you treat it as a complete black box. You make absolutely no assumptions at all. And instead, you build your protocols, in this case, your methods of generating randomness, based on your interactions with this mysterious black box. So you send in challenges, you get back responses, and you use that to generate your randomness. Now, in practice, it is difficult, very difficult, to create a completely device-independent setup. They exist sometimes in laboratories, but approaching the problem from this direction, so the device-dependent approach is laden with hundreds, thousands of assumptions in there, some that we know about, some that we don't know about. By approaching the problem from this direction and making perhaps one assumption, or maybe two assumptions, that are reasonable, fair assumptions, unlike perfect mirrors and perfect detectors, then you get something very interesting. And that's what we've been doing at Cambridge Quantum. And this is what it looks like. So you start off with a quantum computer. And we've got one of those now. And you run some quantum circuits inside it. Now, we then treat that largely as a black box. Now, that's in quotes for a reason, because we do make an assumption. We assume that the circuits we supply to this black box are executed on a general purpose quantum computer. Now notice how that is A, one assumption, and B, true, right? It's something you can verify. You can check, yes, did that run on a quantum computer? Yes, it did. And then we can build a protocol based around challenges and responses to this system. So we're saying nothing about the quantum computer. We don't care about its coherence times. We don't care about its fidelity. Well, we do a little bit, but we don't need to know about that. We just assume it is a quantum computer that executes some circuits. And we send all these challenges and responses. And the challenges are measurement settings for our circuits, and the responses are the results of executing the circuit. And we do that thousands of times, and then we can pass that through a Bell test. And this is the really nice part. The Bell test is a statistical analysis of the inputs and the outputs of this process. And what it gives us here, this is the magic bit right there. It gives us a clear understanding of how much randomness we just obtained from our protocol. You cannot do this classically. This is just not possible to do classically. But with quantum, we can do this. So we have a crystal clear lower bound on how much entropy we've got. Because it's not perfect at this stage. These are, realistically, the machines that we're using, which we don't characterize, are noisy. Right? So we know that we're not going to get complete randomness from there, but we know how much we've got, which allows us to then use some fairly well-established techniques to extract the actual randomness from that larger set of data, and then use a local source of weaker randomness combined with that strong seed to create a stream of randomness that is as close to perfect as you can possibly get. Now, we call this near perfect, and I both love and hate that phrase. I love it because it's correct, and that's how we roll. I hate it because it gives you some sense that we're kind of close to perfect, but it's over there somewhere. So just to give you some sense of how random we're talking about, let's talk about the California State Lottery for a minute. So imagine winning the California State Lottery, standing there with your plastic check looking remarkably unhappy about the situation. There's a 1 in 42 million chance of doing that. So you'd probably feel pretty lucky if you were stood there holding that check. Now imagine you felt luckier still. So you went out next week and you bought just one ticket and you won for a second time. You stood there with the check again. And that would be worldwide news, right? That never happens. So imagine going out a third time the week after and just still feeling a bit lucky and buying another ticket and winning. Then going out a fourth time and buying a ticket and winning. It's just been you. The last 4 draws, you've won them all. Then you go out a fifth time, and you win again. Now, obviously, by this point, you're in jail. But in principle, you are more likely to do that than in any sense to detect that what we've produced from the process I showed you on the previous slide is not perfect. And so this is what we've launched today. Hopefully, you've seen some of the press about it. Quantum Origin is the name of our product. And what Quantum Origin is a cloud-based service for generating the strongest cryptographic keys we've ever seen, because they use verifiable quantum randomness. So this process I was talking about, which mathematically proves how strong the randomness is, we use that to generate the keys that we distribute from here. And it's all made possible thanks to this device-independent approach. This is the key thing. And in case it hasn't dawned on you yet, because I've been focusing on the cybersecurity part, because that's the bit I love, this is also the first commercial use case for a quantum computer. You know, how many people in this room have been asked, oh, when's quantum going to do something? Well, it's Tuesday, the 7th of December, 2021. We can do something with a quantum computer that we cannot do with a classical computer. Now, perhaps this is a little bit bold, but for quantum cybersecurity, I feel like this could be our iPhone moment. We're finally able to realize the potential that's clearly been there for a long time, but needed something to unlock it, and it was this idea of device independence. So I'll just talk briefly about a couple of use cases. So if you've been following our announcements today, we've been talking about a couple of customers who've been working with us already. The first is Fujitsu. So Fujitsu do many, many, many things, as you know, but one part of Fujitsu looks at advanced network technology. So this is software-defined networks. They're trying to give their customers, who are very security conscious, the strongest, most flexible networks imaginable. So we were delighted to work with them earlier this year to integrate Quantum Origin into that stack. Because Quantum Origin, yes, it uses quantum computers, but you don't need to be a quantum physicist to actually use it. It plugs into today's systems easily. So this is an example of supplying classical keys, derived from quantum randomness, but these were AES keys, RSA keys, elliptic curve keys. If you know your cryptography, that's today's algorithms, strengthening against today's problems. But we can also strengthen against tomorrow's problems as well. So the other customer that we've been talking about recently is Axiom Space. Now, you may not have heard of Axiom Space, perhaps. They are building the next space station, the one that will replace the International Space Station. Now, they've got a longer horizon. They're looking 5, 10, 15 years out. And so they need to ensure their data is safe for good. They need to make sure that even when quantum computers sweep through cybersecurity and cause us all kind of headaches, that their data is still safe. And so in one of the coolest projects I've ever done, that even my son thought was quite cool, we sent the first ever post-quantum encrypted communication from space to Earth. From the space station, we sent the message, I think it was hello quantum world, down to Earth, using keys generated from Quantum Origin. So hopefully you have a sense now that it is possible to realize the potential of quantum cybersecurity. And I think we are at a tipping point today. Quantum will fundamentally change cryptography. It allows us to do these things, whether it's randomness, whether it's key distribution, and whether it's something we haven't even figured out yet. But only if we implement it the right way, only if we realize the value. And in the case of key generation, that's something that I think we've achieved today. And if you'd like to learn anything more about Quantum Origin, you can head to our website. Tomorrow, by the way, if you're an early riser like me with jet lag getting up at 4 a.m., we have a webinar, 7 a.m. Pacific time tomorrow, where we'll be joined by some of our partners. We have Thales joining us, one of the leading cybersecurity vendors in the world. And we'll be joined by Axiom Space and Fujitsu. And we'll just be having a nice conversation about quantum cybersecurity and what everybody should be doing about it. So we'd love to have you join us. But otherwise, thank you. That's all I had to say today. I don't know if we have any time for questions.
Questions, yes? Any questions for Duncan? This is difficult to see. Front row.
How do you actually distribute the keys? Because that could be, how do you distribute the keys? That could be a source of insecurity. Do they just get used on site at the cloud service?
Yeah, good question. So if you didn't hear that, it was how do we actually move these keys around once we've generated them? Well, there's a couple of options. I mean, we can just rely on classical cryptography, and that is our predominant approach today. So we obviously have to share these keys in an encrypted fashion, otherwise you've kind of defeated the purpose by sending them from the cloud in clear text. So we wrap them in an encryption key that is quantum resistant, that we share with the other end of the customer system that we're integrating with. So typically we integrate with something like a hardware security module on the other side. But obviously, I know a lot of people here may be working on QKD as well. How we shift these keys around is very flexible. So QKD could be an option at some point in the future, but for now we rely upon classical cryptography.
Any more questions? We have time for one more in the back.
Can you comment on how the Bell inequality used? Can you comment on how the Bell inequality test used here relates to or compares to Scott Aronson's certified randomness?
Well, I think it's a similar kind of concept. I think the thing here is we needed to build a system that was scalable and capable of delivering randomness at the rate that's required for real-world use cases. So we took this approach because it allows us to move towards this device-independent paradigm and yet take advantage of things like these randomness extractors, which decouple the rate of randomness generation from the rate of the quantum computer or anything related to how you capture the initial core randomness. So I would see this as maybe a more a higher output rate, more kind of production scalable approach.
All right, thank you.
Okay, very good. How about one more round of applause for Duncan? Thank you.